January 1944. North Africa desert heat. The unmistakable sound of a loud thud breaks the otherwise oppressive silence of the battlefield. A direct hit. The mighty German Tiger tank, once considered invincible, erupts in smoke flames, licking the sky its massive form, crumpling as the first shell from an American M4 Sherman tears through its armor. The crew inside the German tank barely has time to react before the machine falls silent. The ground shakes from the impact. The air is thick with dust and the stench of burning oil. A second German tank is in sight, moving to reposition, trying to gain an advantage, but it miscalculates. It doesn't get far. Another round is fired. Another thunderous explosion. The second tank stops cold in its tracks. This time, no roar from the engine, no counterfire. Just a sharp final sound of metal twisting under pressure. The field is silent again. In the distance, a third German tank attempts to engage its turret, rotating slowly, trying to find its target. The American crew doesn't hesitate, they've seen this before. The turret locks the gun, fires again, and once more, it hits its mark. The German tank is doomed. Amidst the chaos, the real shock is settling in the Germans. The once indomitable force were vulnerable. The technology they had trusted to win the war could no longer guarantee their survival. This moment, marked by the exact precision of the American assault, would be etched in the minds of those who lived through it. But the full weight of the change is not immediately realized. For a few seconds, everything falls quiet. The sound of war seems to pause, as if the very earth is holding its breath. The Germans had no answer for what they had just faced. And the Americans. They simply prepared for the next fight. No cheers. No triumph. Just the cold knowledge that the game had changed. The war, it seemed, was beginning to tip in a way no one had expected. By early 1944, the balance of power in the Second World War had shifted, but not in ways that many had anticipated. On the front lines of North Africa, where the Allies had begun to gain ground, the German military was still clinging to a powerful myth: their tanks, their U-boats, their Luftwaffe pilots, and their tactical genius. These weapons, once seen as symbols of invincibility, had been honed in a war of relentless aggression. The Germans believed they still held the edge, that their technological superiority could carry them through the darkest hours. But now, something had begun to crack. The Germans were facing an enemy they had underestimated for years: the United States. At first glance, the U.S. military seemed outmatched, bogged down in a war on multiple fronts, facing brutal losses in the Pacific and Europe. But behind the American war machine was an industrial juggernaut and a resolve that would soon overwhelm the Germans' fading confidence. The American supply lines, once thought to be vulnerable and easily disrupted, had become unstoppable. This was not just about a tank battle. The myth of the German Tiger tank was crumbling. The Americans had found a way to defeat it, and it wasn't through superior numbers or brute force alone. It was through ingenuity, relentless adaptation, and most crucially through the ability to replenish their forces at a pace that the Germans could no longer match. In the months leading up to this moment in North Africa, Germany's resources were rapidly depleting. Their tanks were burning through fuel faster than they could replace it, and their once dominant Luftwaffe was starting to see its pilots fall faster than they could train replacements. The U-boats, once a terrifying presence in the Atlantic, could no longer operate with the same stealth or efficiency as before. The Allies had found ways to hunt them down with deadly precision. On the other side, the Germans were still convinced that their tanks, their air force, and their naval superiority could win the war if only they could hold out long enough to break the Allied momentum. But for the Americans, this moment represented the stakes of the war itself. If they could break this German myth, if they could defeat the seemingly indomitable tanks and weapons of the Axis, they would cripple the Germans' ability to wage war on the scale they had become accustomed to. The question wasn't just how long the war could last, it was how much longer could Germany hold on to its technological advantage. Without that edge, they risked losing their ability to fight. The American objective in North Africa and Europe was clear: break the German hold on strategic locations, maintain the supply lines, and force the Germans into a corner where their technological superiority would no longer matter. For the U.S., each battle was not just about achieving victory. It was about proving that the Germans' reliance on superior weaponry and tanks was no longer a guarantee. This wasn't a battle of tanks. It was a battle of time. The Germans believed they still had a few moves left, one last push to stop the Allies from breaking their defenses. They had long relied on their heavy tanks like the Tiger to stand as the final word on the battlefield. The belief was simple. One Tiger tank could hold up a street, destroy entire platoons, and force the enemy into submission. Similarly, their U-boats, which had tormented Allied convoys for years, were still a deadly force capable of disrupting the American supply lines. And their elite Luftwaffe pilots could still tear through the skies unchallenged. But the Americans had learned. Their tanks were not as heavily armored, but they were mobile. Their bombers might be vulnerable without fighter escorts, but that was changing. The Sherman tank, once seen as an underdog, was evolving into a reliable machine capable of going toe-to-toe with the best the Germans had to offer. And when paired with long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, it became a deadly force on the ground and in the air. The Allied forces had learned the critical lesson: to defeat the Germans they needed to outlast them. The American production lines were humming at full speed, pumping out tanks, planes, and ammunition at a rate the Germans could never match. While Germany was trying to keep its best tanks and pilots in service, the United States was prepared to sacrifice equipment and personnel, knowing it could replace them quickly. This moment in North Africa wasn't a random victory, it was a turning point. If the Allies could maintain their supply lines, if they could push forward without being bogged down by German resistance, they would win the war. The Germans knew they had to stop the American advance here, or their entire war effort would unravel. Yet, they could no longer keep up with the relentless pace set by the U.S. And as the Americans pressed on, the Germans' belief in their technological superiority began to falter. They had underestimated the United States. And now they were starting to realize the Americans were playing a different game entirely. This moment in the desert, this battle over tanks and weapons, was more than just a tactical shift. It was the realization that the war was no longer about what the Germans had, but about how long they could keep it. Time was running out for them. The Americans were not just fighting for victory, they were fighting to collapse the myth of German invincibility. And with each new battle, it became clearer that they were on the brink of succeeding. For the Allies, the cost was steep, but the payoff was more than worth it. The door to the final defeat of Germany was wide open, and the Americans were about to walk through. The German Tiger tank had long been regarded as a nearly unstoppable force on the battlefield. Its thick armor and powerful 88mm gun gave it an aura of invincibility. On open terrain, it could pick off enemy tanks from hundreds of meters away, the shells hitting with the force of thunder. Allied forces, especially the Americans, had learned to fear the Tiger, with many of their Sherman tanks falling victim to its superior firepower. But the truth was, the Tiger was not without its weaknesses. It was a machine built for open ground, designed for long-range fire and battle in large, flat expanses. The Tiger's heavy armor, while nearly impervious to most Allied weapons, also made it an unwieldy beast. It was slow, lumbering, and struggled to maneuver in tight spaces. Its turret had a slower rate of rotation, which made it vulnerable in urban combat or close-quarter battles. On the open plains, it was a king. In the narrow streets of a town, it was a target waiting to be exploited. The American Sherman tank, on the other hand, was much lighter, smaller, and far more mobile. It was built with a focus on adaptability. Its 75mm gun was effective against most Axis armor, and while it couldn't penetrate the Tiger's thick armor head-on, it could still damage vulnerable parts of the tank when fired from the right angles. But the Sherman's real strength lay in its mobility, its ability to use the terrain to its advantage. While the Tiger struggled to move quickly, the Sherman could dart in and out of cover, flanking the German tank and firing from angles that the Tiger's heavy armor couldn't protect. The first time the Americans learned this lesson was in the streets of a North African town where the Tiger's imposing silhouette seemed unbeatable. But the Americans had learned quickly from their early losses. They developed tactics that allowed their lighter tanks to outmaneuver the heavier German tanks. The Sherman crews would wait for the Tigers to move into the narrow streets and then use their mobility to get around the German tank. The key was getting behind the Tiger, where its thick armor wasn't as effective. But even the best tactics couldn't win without the proper support. And here the Americans had an advantage. They had learned the value of combined arms, working in concert with infantry, air support, and artillery to destroy the German tanks from multiple angles. Air support was the game changer. As the Allies gained more control of the skies, the Luftwaffe's effectiveness began to wane. The P-51 Mustang, for example, was a deadly escort fighter that could protect Allied bombers from enemy aircraft while also providing vital air cover for ground forces. With their fighters covering the ground troops, the Americans were free to focus on their primary objective, taking out the German tanks. The role of U.S. artillery in this fight also cannot be overstated. The U.S. Army had developed its artillery tactics to a point where they could effectively engage German armor at a distance even when visibility was poor. The 105mm howitzer, a weapon already familiar to the troops, could be used to strike German tanks from a distance with surprising accuracy. When coupled with air support, these artillery strikes could force the Tigers to retreat or face immediate destruction. But it wasn't just the Sherman or artillery that made the difference. It was the American adaptability, the relentless willingness to learn and evolve. The Germans, too, had their own strategic advantage, but it was becoming increasingly clear that their technological superiority had its limits. In the heat of battle, the precision of the Sherman crew and the efficiency of their tactics began to outweigh the brute strength of the German machine. The U.S. Navy, meanwhile, was adapting in its own right. The Hedgehog anti-submarine weapon, designed to launch a pattern of depth charges ahead of a target instead of dropping them behind, was proving to be a devastating tool against German U-boats. Previously, Allied forces had struggled to keep up with the U-boats, which were elusive and deadly when submerged. But the Hedgehog allowed the Allies to strike first, forcing the U-boats to surface or be destroyed. The Americans weren't relying on luck or chance, they were systematically dismantling the enemy's strengths piece by piece. As the Americans honed these tactics, they realized they were not just adapting to the battlefield, they were changing the very nature of warfare. The Germans, in contrast, could no longer afford to take risks. Their heavy tanks, the pride of their arsenal, were too valuable to lose in urban combat or close engagements. The Germans couldn't afford to sacrifice their Tigers or their elite pilots. Each loss was critical, each casualty irreparable. The Americans, however, had the industrial power to replace lost tanks and planes at an astonishing rate. Detroit's factories could turn out more Shermans in a day than the Germans could build Tigers in a month. The same logic applied to the German U-boat fleet, once considered the ultimate predator in the Atlantic. For years, these boats had been a constant threat to Allied supply convoys, cutting off vital resources from reaching the front lines. But the U.S. Navy's increased use of sonar, along with the deployment of hunter-killer groups, teams of warships specifically designed to locate and destroy U-boats, completely altered the balance of power at sea. The once dominant U-boat force was now being hunted down and destroyed before it could strike. At the same time, the Germans faced a logistical nightmare. Their supply lines were stretched thin, their fuel reserves running out, and their ability to replace tanks and planes was increasingly limited. The Allied industrial might had allowed the United States to replenish its losses and continue pushing forward, while the Germans could only cling to their dwindling technological edge. The real crux of the problem for the Germans was that their military philosophy had been predicated on the idea that technological superiority would win the war. They believed their tanks, their U-boats, and their elite soldiers could overpower the Allies. But the Americans were proving that in warfare, it's not just about technology. It's about the ability to adapt, to evolve, to learn from failure and use it to improve. The Germans had been operating under a false assumption, the belief that they could hold on to their technological advantage long enough to win. But with the Allies closing in, the walls were beginning to collapse. The reality was clear. The Germans couldn't keep up. Their heavy tanks, their U-boats, and their fighter planes, once feared across the globe, were now nothing more than ticking clocks, their power slowly ticking down to zero. This was no accident. The battles were not just fought with tanks or airplanes, they were fought with ingenuity, speed, and the overwhelming advantage of constant resupply. And the Allies, particularly the United States, had learned how to fight smarter, how to use the power of industry and adaptation to break the back of the once dominant German war machine. This wasn't just a series of isolated victories, it was a strategic shift that would soon be felt across every theater of the war. The Germans, though they didn't know it yet, were fighting the final chapters of their war. And the Americans, they had already begun to rewrite the rules. The battlefield was a cacophony of sound explosions, the rattle of machine guns, the deafening roar of tanks moving across the dusty plains. But inside the cramped interior of the American M4 Sherman tank, there was only a tense, focused silence. The crew moved like a well-oiled machine, their actions precise, almost mechanical. Their eyes flicked from the periscope to the firing controls, scanning for targets, calculating their next move. There was no room for hesitation, no time for fear. Inside the German Tiger tank, the mood was very different. The crew was confident, almost cocky. They had been through this before. Their tank was the king of the battlefield, the most fearsome machine in the world. The crew moved with an assuredness born of experience, their routine well rehearsed. Load AP fire, track the target came the orders, each word a command passed down through years of training. There was a sense of certainty the Tiger tank had never failed them before, and it wouldn't fail now. The U.S. crew knew the odds. They were the underdogs, outgunned and outclassed in terms of raw firepower, but they weren't without their advantages. The Sherman tank might have been lighter and less armored than the German monster it was facing, but it was fast, maneuverable, and deadly in the right hands. The American crew's advantage wasn't in firepower, it was in tactics, in being able to outsmart the enemy, to use the terrain to their advantage. Suddenly, through the periscope, the crew spotted the Tiger. The massive machine loomed ahead, its long barrel pointing straight toward them. The crew braced themselves. This was it. There was no turning back now. They would have to take the shot, and they would have to take it fast. Target locked, the gunner's voice cut through the tension. The commander's voice came quickly after. Fire when ready. The first shot rang out, a boom that reverberated through the hull of the Sherman. The crew didn't wait to see if it had hit. They were already moving, shifting positions, reloading, adjusting their aim. Their whole focus was on keeping their movements precise, fast, and deadly. But then something happened that none of them had expected. The Tiger didn't immediately retaliate. The crew inside the German tank had been too slow. The Sherman's round hit the target with deadly accuracy. The sound of metal twisting and cracking echoed through the battlefield. Inside the Tiger, the scene was chaos. The shell had pierced the armor, and the crew was thrown into disarray. A flash of fire. The turret groaned as it slowly began to turn, but it was too late. The damage was done. The German crew scrambled to assess the damage, shouting commands, but the tank was already immobilized. Their confidence was slipping away fast. Inside the Sherman, the atmosphere was calm but focused. Target burning came the radio transmission. The crew had already begun to think ahead, preparing for the next engagement. There was no celebration, no sense of triumph. They simply moved on their training, kicking in their focus unbroken. The second German tank appeared, but this time the American crew was prepared. They had seen the mistake the Germans had made earlier, and they knew what to do. The Tiger was moving slowly, trying to reposition. The Sherman darted into a position, using the cover of a nearby building to conceal its movements. Angle, 45 degrees, the gunner muttered to himself as he lined up the shot. He fired again. The result was the same. The German tank was destroyed before it could even fight back. In the American crew's mind, this wasn't about the thrill of victory. It was a routine, a necessary part of the mission. They didn't waste time savoring their success. Their focus was on the next target, the next threat. The process was what mattered. They didn't have time for heroics. They had been trained for this moment, and they were executing exactly what they had been taught. On the German side, however, the feeling was entirely different. As the second Tiger tank burned, the reality began to set in. This wasn't the quick, routine victory they had grown accustomed to. The crew inside the Tiger had been trained to expect superiority, but now they were forced to confront something they hadn't prepared for, a loss, and a swift one at that. The radio crackled as the German commander called for reinforcements, but it was clear the Tigers were no longer the dominant force on this battlefield. The crew could feel the weight of their vulnerability, something they hadn't considered before. The confidence that had once carried them through so many battles now seemed like an illusion, a myth that had been shattered in a matter of seconds. In the second German tank, the crew tried to salvage the situation, repositioning their tank for another shot, but the American crew was already on the move again. They had already adjusted to the situation, already learned from the previous encounter. Their response was immediate, their movements coordinated, fast and precise. The German tank didn't stand a chance. The American crew moved in sync, their training and instincts guiding them. Their next shot was as calculated as the first, precise, deliberate, and lethal. The Tiger didn't even get a chance to retaliate. It was over almost before it had begun. Inside the Sherman, the crew didn't celebrate. They didn't even speak. There was only the sound of the engine, the low hum of the battlefield, the clattering of the turret as it turned to the next objective. Every movement was dictated by their training, their experience, and the deep understanding that in war there was no room for mistakes. For the German crew, the shock of failure lingered in the air. The defeat wasn't just tactical, it was psychological. They had believed their Tiger was invincible, a fortress on tracks. Now they were learning a harsh lesson. Their once unstoppable tank was just another target. The myth had been broken. As the American crew moved on, the reality of their success settled in. They weren't just surviving the war, they were shaping it. The Germans could no longer depend on their tanks to win every battle. The Americans had figured out their weaknesses, and they were exploiting them with deadly precision. And inside the Sherman, as the battle raged on, the crew didn't flinch. They didn't hesitate. They had their orders, their purpose, and their focus. They were part of a greater machine now, and this war was going to be won one shot at a time. Weapons, it was the result of a far broader strategic framework. Behind every successful strike against the German Tigers, every tank kill, every U-boat sunk, there was an industrial powerhouse driving the American military forward. The ability to adapt, change tactics on the fly, and outlast the enemy was directly tied to the U.S. industrial capacity and logistics, which were unparalleled in the world at the time. It wasn't just the soldiers or the tanks themselves. It was the vast machinery of American production, decision-making, and logistics that made victory possible. The Germans, despite their technological advancements, were simply outclassed in this realm. By 1944, the Germans were running on fumes both figuratively and literally. Their heavy tanks, which had once been the cornerstone of their armored divisions, were now the anchors dragging down their war effort. Each Tiger and Panther tank represented an enormous investment of resources, raw materials, manufacturing time, and manpower. However, as the war continued, the Germans found themselves unable to replace their losses at the same pace as the Americans. The industrial capacity of the Axis, especially Germany, had been overstretched, and the Allies' overwhelming production capabilities began to chip away at the Germans' edge. The American industrial machine had proved to be far more resilient than the Germans had ever anticipated. The sheer scale of U.S. production, particularly after the U.S. entered the war in full force, made it difficult for the Germans to compete. Factory workers in Detroit, engineers at the Ford Motor Company, and assembly line workers across the country were turning out tanks, trucks, planes, and ammunition at a pace the Germans simply couldn't match. The production of Sherman tanks alone was staggering. By mid-1944, the U.S. was producing over 2,000 Shermans every month. This number dwarfed Germany's output of heavy tanks, like the Tiger and Panther, which were produced in far fewer numbers due to the time and resources required to build them. The Sherman tank, though often criticized for its lack of armor compared to the Tiger, had one critical advantage: that the Germans could not replicate its ability to be manufactured quickly and in vast numbers. It didn't need to be a perfect machine. It didn't need to be the best in every category. It simply needed to be good enough and available in overwhelming quantities. While the Germans were pouring all their resources into maintaining their elite weaponry, the Allies were flooding the battlefield with sheer numbers. For every Sherman that was knocked out, there was another one waiting to replace it, ready to go back into the fight. The Germans, on the other hand, had to treat every Tiger like a rare and valuable asset, unable to afford the losses the Americans could simply replace. This shift in production capacity wasn't limited to just tanks. The U.S. Navy's ability to churn out ships, for example, was crucial to the outcome of the war. The Liberty ships, cargo ships designed to transport supplies across the Atlantic, were built in such large numbers that by 1944, the U.S. had a near insurmountable advantage in naval logistics. These ships carried not just ammunition and weapons, but food, fuel, and medical supplies, ensuring that the Allied forces could continue their operations far beyond what the Germans could have imagined. The Allies' ability to maintain constant supply to the front lines meant they could outlast the Germans in terms of both manpower and material resources. At the same time, the American logistical system ensured that every piece of equipment that went to war was carefully planned, tracked, and efficiently deployed. It was no coincidence that the Red Ball Express, a convoy system created to transport supplies from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines in France, became a symbol of American logistical superiority. Operating 24/7, these convoys moved at an incredible pace, delivering over 1,2,000 tons of supplies every day. This network ensured that the advancing Allied forces were never without ammunition, fuel, or food, even as they pushed deeper into German-held territory. In contrast, the German supply lines were constantly under strain. With fewer resources and much of their industrial capacity destroyed by Allied bombing raids, Germany's ability to sustain its military was rapidly diminishing. The Germans' reliance on their heavy tanks like the Tiger was also a logistical nightmare. These machines were resource-intensive and difficult to repair. Their complex systems required highly specialized parts, and every damaged Tiger meant a significant loss to the German war effort. Unlike the Allies, the Germans could not replace their heavy tanks at the same pace they were being destroyed. This disparity between the American and German logistical capabilities wasn't just about numbers, it was about efficiency and adaptability. The Germans had a superior tank for a time, but the Americans had a superior system. American military doctrine emphasized the importance of combined arms, integrating infantry, artillery, air support, and tanks into a seamless fighting force. The Sherman tank wasn't meant to be the best tank on the battlefield. It was meant to work in concert with other American military assets. The coordination between U.S. forces, whether it was tanks working with artillery or bombers working with fighter escorts, made the difference. This synergy was something the Germans struggled to match. Meanwhile, the German command structure was increasingly bogged down by internal strife and indecision. In the early years of the war, the Germans were able to rely on brilliant tactical leaders like Erwin Rommel in North Africa and Heinz Guderian on the Eastern Front. But as the war dragged on, the German military command became more rigid and fractured. Decisions that once took days to execute now took weeks, if not months, due to the worsening supply situation and the growing inability of their high command to coordinate the war effort. One of the most significant blows to the Germans was their inability to adapt to the evolving tactics of the Allies. The U.S. military was quick to learn from its early failures and adapt. The Germans, on the other hand, struggled to adjust their strategy to counter the new American tactics, especially in the face of the overwhelming material advantage the Allies had gained. The Allied intelligence network, which had been steadily improving throughout the war, also began to outmatch German counterintelligence. The Americans could predict German movements, supply lines, and even tactics with increasing accuracy, making it even harder for the Germans to keep up. As the war moved into its later stages, the Germans' inability to replace their tanks and aircraft, combined with the overwhelming power of American industrial output, meant that they were fighting a losing battle not just on the battlefield, but on the production lines as well. Their manufacturing facilities, already under strain from Allied bombing raids, were being destroyed faster than they could rebuild them. The Americans, in contrast, simply continued to produce at a blistering pace. This industrial gap would prove to be decisive in the final years of the war. While the Germans continued to cling to their most advanced technology, hoping that the next wonder weapon would turn the tide of battle, the Allies were flooding the front lines with mass-produced reliable equipment. As a result, every engagement, whether it was in the streets of France or the plains of Russia, became a war of attrition that the Germans simply could not win. Ultimately, it was not just the American tanks or aircraft that won the war, it was the relentless power of U.S. industry and logistics, the ability to replace losses, adapt quickly, and outlast the enemy. The production line had become just as deadly a weapon as the Sherman or the P-51 Mustang. And as the Germans fought to maintain their advantage, the Allies were already moving ahead, ensuring that their victory was inevitable. The American decision-making was driven by a system that, in hindsight, could be called one of the most effective war machines in history. It wasn't just about having better equipment, it was about having the means to keep fighting. The Germans, despite their early successes, had nothing like it. Their edge had eroded piece by piece until there was nothing left to do but fight for survival. And it was in this moment, the moment of overwhelming industrial superiority, that the fate of the war had already been sealed. The first time the German crew realized their Tiger tank was no longer invincible was the moment their turret locked in place, unable to react as the first American round slammed into the thick armor. The deafening noise of the blast reverberated through the hull, and the feeling of disbelief crept in. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Tiger was feared by all. It was the weapon that had crushed Allied forces time and time again. But now, with smoke billowing from the tank's damaged systems, the myth was beginning to collapse. As the turret struggled to turn, as the fire inside raged out of control, the crew inside the German tank began to understand that they weren't invincible anymore. The Americans, it seemed, had cracked their code. They had found the weak points in the German war machine, and they were exploiting them with ruthless efficiency. But the realization didn't come immediately. It wasn't just about the tanks. The Germans for years had believed in the superiority of their entire military philosophy, fast, overwhelming technological warfare. The myth of the invincible German soldier, equipped with the finest weapons in the world, had been the cornerstone of their strategy. But now that myth was being dismantled, one shot at a time. Inside the Sherman, the crew had already moved on. They didn't have the luxury of basking in victory. Their focus was elsewhere, on the next target, the next threat. The cold, calculated nature of their combat was the opposite of what the Germans had grown accustomed to. There was no room for celebration, no cheers after a kill. The American crew members understood that they were fighting not just for survival but for the future of the war. And every shot, every engagement was another step toward ensuring the Germans would never regain their advantage. It was the beginning of the end for the myth of the German war machine. The Tiger tank had been the pride of the Wehrmacht. It was the weapon that everyone feared, the monster of the battlefield. But now it was becoming clear that the monster had a fatal flaw. And in that moment of realization, the Germans could no longer rely on their technology to win the war. The American tanks didn't win just because they had better weapons or better armor. They won because they understood the value of adaptability. The Germans, for all their technological sophistication, had built a military machine that relied heavily on superior hardware without thinking about the long-term sustainability of that system. As their supply lines dwindled, as their resources were stretched thin, the Americans kept coming. They had the numbers, they had the industry, and above all, they had the logistical superiority to outlast their enemy. But perhaps the most devastating blow to the German myth was the recognition that the Americans were learning faster than they could adapt. The early losses suffered by the Allies had given way to a wave of innovation and adaptation. The Sherman tank, once seen as a weak cousin to the German heavy tanks, now became a force in its own right. The Americans weren't just throwing bodies and machines at the Germans. They were adjusting, changing tactics, figuring out what worked and what didn't. The myth of German invincibility was built not just on tanks or aircraft, but on a larger narrative of superiority. The belief that their advanced technology would carry them through, that their innovations in military doctrine would always in 2010 give them the upper hand. But this myth was about to be shattered. It wasn't just the tanks on the ground. The Luftwaffe, once the most powerful air force in the world, was also beginning to crumble. The Allies had learned to counter the Luftwaffe's tactics using long-range fighter escorts and advanced anti-aircraft technologies. The Germans, who had once ruled the skies, now found themselves constantly under threat from American bombers and fighters. Similarly, the U-boats, which had been terrorizing Allied shipping routes, were no longer as invincible as they had once seemed. The Americans had developed more advanced sonar technologies along with more efficient anti-submarine warfare tactics. The days when a U-boat could operate with impunity beneath the waves were rapidly fading. And with each loss, the Germans realized they couldn't afford the luxury of trying to win a war of attrition against the Allies. As the reality of their situation set in the German military began to shift tactics, the overconfidence that had marked their early successes was replaced by a creeping desperation. No longer able to rely on their superior technology, the Germans began to avoid direct confrontations with American tanks, planes, and artillery. The pride they had once taken in their advanced weaponry now became a burden. Each loss of a Tiger tank, a U-boat, or a Luftwaffe ace felt like a wound they couldn't afford. The turning point came when the German High Command, once so confident in their technological supremacy, began to issue orders based on survival rather than conquest. No longer were they focused on annihilating the Allies, they were focused on preserving their dwindling resources. The Tiger tank, once the embodiment of German might, became a symbol of their inability to maintain the edge they had once enjoyed. In the midst of this transformation, the American soldiers on the front lines did not wait for the Germans to concede. They continued to press forward, armed not just with tanks and artillery, but with a new understanding of the enemy's weaknesses. The myth was no longer a threat, it was a relic of the past, an illusion that had been shattered in the fires of combat. And so, as the battlefields grew quieter and the German forces began to retreat, the last echoes of the myth of invincibility faded into history. The Germans, once certain they were unbeatable, now faced the grim truth: the myth of superiority had been demolished. The day the Tiger tank was no longer feared was the day the German war effort truly began to unravel. No longer were they the hunters, they were the hunted. The myth of the German war machine had collapsed under the weight of its own failures, and now the Allies were ready to finish the job. The battle for the supremacy of the German Tiger tank, once considered an indomitable force, marked a profound shift in the course of the war. By the summer of 1944, the Allies had effectively shattered the myth of the Tiger's invulnerability. The consequences of this loss for Germany would be far-reaching not just on the battlefield, but in the psychology of their military leadership and the morale of their soldiers. The collapse of their technological superiority exposed the fundamental cracks in their strategy, which had long been reliant on fear and intimidation. In the immediate aftermath of these devastating defeats, the Germans were forced into damage control. They could no longer trust their once feared heavy tanks to break the Allied lines, and each loss of a Tiger was a strategic blow that the Germans could not replace. Their factories, already operating at full capacity, struggled to keep up with the damage done by the relentless Allied bombardment. Fuel shortages and industrial sabotage became commonplace, further compounding the Germans' inability to maintain their edge in weaponry. For the Allies, however, the collapse of the Tiger myth was not just a tactical victory, it was a psychological one. The belief that the Germans had been invincible, that their technological superiority would crush the Allies, had been shattered. It was a defining moment that reaffirmed the reality that no single weapon could determine the outcome of a war. The myth of German invincibility, which had so thoroughly pervaded the Axis forces' mindset, was no longer an obstacle. This victory, however, came at a steep cost. The Allies had been forced to adapt quickly, learning from their early mistakes and finding ways to counter the Germans' technological advantage. The Sherman tank, though often outclassed in terms of firepower and armor, had proved its worth in sheer numbers and adaptability. The battle for supremacy between the American and German tanks was not about who had the best individual weapon, it was about who could best utilize their strengths in the long term. But the lasting legacy of the battle was not just the tactical shift, it was the larger narrative of industrial might versus technological arrogance. The Germans had relied on the belief that their advanced technology would win them the war, but they were unable to maintain their technological edge in the face of the overwhelming production capacity of the United States. The Allies' industrial capacity, their ability to manufacture equipment at a speed and scale that outstripped the Germans, was one of the greatest assets of the war. While the Germans fought to preserve their few advanced machines, the Americans continued to flood the battlefield with tanks, planes, and supplies. The war in many ways had become a battle of endurance: who could sustain the longest, who could adapt the fastest, who could replace losses without missing a beat. The Americans, with their immense industrial base, proved to be the far more adaptable and sustainable force. In the long term, the myth of the Tiger tank, and by extension, the myth of German technological superiority, would serve as a cautionary tale for military planners. The Germans had invested everything in a series of high-tech weapons and strategies, hoping that these machines could carry them to victory. But in the end, it was the ability to mass-produce, to sustain the fight, and to adapt that won the war. The Germans had relied on superior machines to carry them forward, but those machines were ultimately too costly, too difficult to maintain, and too vulnerable to the changing tides of war. The psychological impact on both sides of the battlefield was profound. The German military, once confident in their ability to defeat the Allies with advanced technology, now found themselves on the defensive. The myth of invincibility was broken, and the soldiers who once believed in their tanks' superiority now faced the harsh reality that they could be overwhelmed. Their tanks no longer struck fear into the hearts of the enemy. For the Allies, the victory over the Tiger tanks was a pivotal moment. It was a realization that no force, no matter how seemingly unstoppable, was invulnerable. The battle was not just about weaponry, it was about adaptability, resilience, and industrial might. As the war progressed, the Allies continued to press forward, learning from every encounter, evolving and outpacing the Germans in every way. What if the Americans had been able to deploy tanks like the Pershing earlier in the war? Could the myth of the German Tiger have been shattered even sooner? The question is one that has lingered among historians, for the eventual success of the Americans didn't just lie in technological advancements, but in the combination of industrial prowess, effective strategy, and willingness to adapt. The Germans, with their obsession for technological perfection, had missed the simple truth: the war wasn't won on the battlefield alone. It was won in factories, in the ability to replace losses, and in the resilience of the soldiers who continued to fight day after day. The myth of the Tiger tank might have collapsed, but the war was far from over. Next, we turn to the Panther, a machine that was heralded as the perfect medium tank by the Germans. The so-called perfect tank was about to meet America's workhorse, the Sherman, in a fight that would prove to be just as pivotal. Would the Panther, still feared by the Allies, be able to hold up in the face of the overwhelming force that the Americans were bringing to the battlefield? The stage was set for the next chapter in the war, where both sides would continue to test the limits of their machines, their strategies, and their will to survive.